In the 2010s, there was a revival of the CRPG genre, which is something one might refer to as the CRPG Renaissance. First, you had the remasters of the original Baldur's Gate games, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 by Beamdog, and then you had a slew of new titles coming out that often were very similar or regarded as spiritual successors to Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. Pillars of Eternity, both Deadfire and the original, were such games, but you also had Tyranny, Wasteland 2, and Divinity Original Sin, as well as Divinity Original Sin 2. And all of these games had systems and an overall ambiance that was very reminiscent of what we used to play back in the late 90s and early 2000s. There was a huge nostalgia that accompanied this revival. And if you watched my video on my top 5 RPGs, or modern RPGs to put it more accurately, then you would know that some of these games I rank among the best CRPGs out there. And these were all produced more or less within 6 or 7 years. All these games represent a return to something that used to be. Because despite the games looking better, visually they're better, other innovations that you might see here and there, they all, as I mentioned, have this powerful nostalgia effect. And they all are basically old school CRPGs that were intended to tap into an older audience. An audience that played the classic CRPGs in the late 90s, early 2000s, maybe even further back, and were somewhat older now, but perhaps had a bit more money to spend on these types of games. And though I would never say that these games were not ambitious, they were not necessarily shooting for the sky. They were meant to be self-contained, relatively small projects. Many of them were funded primarily by Kickstarter funds, i.e. people donating to the game-making process. And because the people who donated to these types of games had a relatively decent notion of what to expect and what they wanted, it wasn't a problem that these games didn't have a huge scope. They weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, they were trying to make the wheel even better than it was before. And in some regards, they really succeeded, which is why at least I call it a renaissance of the CRPG genre. But that was then, and we've moved on, and the year is currently 2024. And it doesn't seem to be the case that a lot of developers want to make these types of games anymore. And we'll get into this in a bit. But the question I'm asking here is fundamentally, are we past peak CRPG interest? In the sense that we have to concede, especially as older players, but not exclusively, this applies to everyone in any age category or bracket, that a lot of the things we like are due to nostalgia. And we get used to, in the gaming world, certain systems that we grew up with or we became accustomed to, and we start to like those things because they're familiar. But a lot of these developers who made these types of games, if they're not outright trying to move away from that type of game, that type of isometric, classic CRPG style, they want to at least innovate in ways that don't necessarily sync well with the original vision of what a CRPG is. And for the record, I get this question pretty frequently, what is a CRPG? Well, basically, and this is the simplest definition I can come up with, a CRPG is a game that emerged exclusively on the computer platform, i.e. PC platform, had an isometric camera view, and had a lot of stats and mechanics involved in the game that you didn't have to understand, but you probably should have understood in order to enjoy the game and profit from the game to its fullest. So it's a fairly specific definition. As we moved into the 2020s, I think we're moving away from that, and even the general expectation of what a CRPG should be. And I hate to bring this up, but it's always the case that we have to bring this up because it was such a game changer, a game breaker, if you will, Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 is a weird CRPG, and I love the game. It was number 5 on my list, and I cited the reasons why it made that list. But it does a lot of things differently. It only sort of has classic isometric view that you'd become accustomed to over the decades. It is very heavy in dialogue, voice dialogue, most important point, and cinematic cutscenes. I've argued this before, I'll do it again. I think that's the main reason for its popularity, not its combat systems, not its mechanics. And so Baldur's Gate 3, although technically still a CRPG by every metric, is also a lot of things that a CRPG is not. And as is custom, when somebody breaks the wheel and sort of reinvents it, which is sort of what Baldur's Gate 3 did, a lot of people want to follow suit and do something similar. And in my discussion of what Owlcat is up to next, I mentioned, and I'll mention again, that the CEO wants to innovate on their games, and he explicitly and exclusively mentioned Baldur's Gate 3 in this context. He talked about more voice acting, making the games overall more voiced. He talked about more cinematic cutscenes, and that Owlcat has to improve on this. So Owlcat is another contender that probably will try to move away from what we have over time become accustomed to as a quote-unquote CRPG, simply because things do change, and games develop further, and that's fine. But the concern I have here, as an avid CRPG player, is that you can do all of that, but Larian did something quite unique in that they were able to please basically everybody. The people who like Baldur's Gate 3 for reasons of characters and dialogue and cinematic cutscenes, i.e. as a dating simulator, I'm half kidding and half not, they're satisfied. The people who enjoyed the meaty mechanics and the build guides and all this sort of thing, they enjoyed that too. Basically, everyone got what they wanted, more or less, at least as closely as a developer has ever managed in the history of gaming, in my humble opinion. And that's a very difficult trick to pull off. I love Owlcat games, for example, but am I nearly as confident they can do that? I'm not sure. Probably not. And we also have to bear in mind that the CRPG genre is a niche one. It's small. The people who enjoy it to a great degree, there are not many of us. And even Josh Sawyer, Obsidian veteran, who basically created the Pillars of Eternity series, told us years later that he wished he had done Deadfire differently. But he's half-jokingly said, I will make Pillars of Eternity 3 when I have Baldur's Gate 3's budget, or when Phil Spencer gives me $100 million, or something to that effect. So you can say a lot of these developers who helped develop some of these original CRPGs want to at least partly move away from that. And a lot of that makes sense because we have to be honest with ourselves. The aesthetics of the CRPG genre are an extension of the technological limitations that allowed them to exist at the time, meaning that in 1999 or 2000, you could only do so much, and the isometric camera and setting was basically as good as you could get while still making the game look attractive, aesthetic, and appealing. We've moved on though since then, and the possibilities are a lot greater. So other than for the nostalgia effect, it makes sense that a lot of developers don't necessarily want to drown in nostalgia and want to move on and create something more newish, not necessarily new, but newish, that might have a lot of these older elements, but also innovates and moves forward. But as I suggested, my concern, and it might be your concern as well, is that it's very difficult to please everybody. And because the CRPG genre is very niche, it's not a huge market, and understandably developers want to do well, they want their games to sell well, we might see a shift away from a lot of classic CRPG elements to something that's more mainstream and accommodating of the average person. Which makes sense. Things that are niche because they appeal to a certain audience, and that audience is unique in its receptivity towards that niche. When you want to expand beyond that audience, you have to, for lack of a better phrase, dumb things down and change a lot about the game, otherwise it won't appeal to the broader audience, i.e. the average person. And so my fear going forward is that we very much have passed peak CRPG. Yes, there was this Renaissance period. It was fantastic, and it was a privilege to experience it, but going forward, I think developers, even if they have heavily focused on CRPGs, are going to radically alter their games in ways that we might not expect and might not even like, in an effort to, frankly speaking, gain a greater, wider audience. And I don't even blame them for that, but we have to bear in mind that it is very difficult to please everybody. And to offer my 2 cents here, and this is just my own opinion, I think niche is absolutely fine and fantastic. Niches are wonderful, in whatever walk of life they might refer to, in this case, gaming, because it allows a certain audience to really appreciate things to their fullest and to their utmost. By making things appeal too broadly, you lose that, and you lose the special qualities that went into that niche and defined it. Now, I'm not a prophet of doom. Like I said, I think developers will continue to make good CRPGs. I just think we're going to have to get used to things being somewhat different than they used to be, because not everyone is as entranced by nostalgia as many of us are, and they fundamentally want something else. And I think the big thing, the really big thing, will be the voice acting and the cinematic cutscenes. most people, most modern gamers, probably want something along those lines. I've done a survey poll on this channel, and I made an entire video about this, and overwhelmingly, most people want voice acting, and most people want nice cinematic cutscenes. And I think in many of those cases, not necessarily in the case of my audience, many people will be willing to sacrifice other things if they can still get their voice acting and cinematic cutscenes. Ultimately, this is a question of budget. Indie games with more limitations will probably still cling to the non-voice acting and non-cinematic cutscene model, but other more experienced developers, I'm not so sure. And as I said, we should all be worried about attempting to please everybody. To me, to my mind, again, just my opinion, CRPGs don't need to become the most popular genre out there. They don't need to become known to everybody. They can remain a niche, they can be innovated upon, they can be improved upon, but I'm worried that the entire process might turn into a popularity contest because developers want more recognition and they want to reach a wider audience, and I have a sneaking suspicion that CRPGs as a genre could potentially suffer a great deal. In any event, those are my thoughts on that, but I'm even more interested in your thoughts on the matter. Are you an avid CRPG player? I'm assuming you are if you're subscribed to me. What do you think? Do you think we are past peak CRPG? Do you think we are moving into a new direction where things just won't be the same as they used to be? Do let me know. I'd be intrigued to read it all. And as always, thank you for tuning in. If you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out and helps out the channel. And I'll check you out next time. Take care.